Hi, and welcome to Regulating the Revolution, the Revolution.Aero town hall. We're delighted to have David Norton, a partner at Sheffield, Bowen, McKinley and Norton, and we're going to take a deep dive into regulation. Please ask as many questions as you like. Raise your hands and join in and chat. David's going to answer everything today. There's no charge.
That's right. Free legal advice. No,
free legal advice.
Not free legal advice. Definitely.
But yeah,
high level.
And only about aviation. We're not doing elections.
Yeah, that's right.
That's off topic. David, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you, Alistair? Very good to see you.
Great to see you too. Great to see the bow tie as always. Do you want to start? Should we start by how did you end up in aviation?
Thank you. I'd love to talk about that. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. So it never occurred to me to be a lawyer. I fell in love with airplanes when I was 4 years old and climbed on board a Tin Goose for the first time, a Ford Tin Goose. So that led me down the path of somehow I managed to get into the Air Force Academy, and that was in the early 80s. And then I had a chance to fly for the Air Force for 9 years. So that was a lot of fun. I got all over the world, flew really big airplanes, really fancy people. Now, that being said, when I got to the 9-year point, I hit the proverbial fork in the road, and I had remembered back to a class that I'd taken at the academy called Law for Commanders. And I thought that was really intriguing, but at the time I was going to go fly, so I wasn't worried about the law. But I heard about this class, or I remembered that class, and I heard about another friend of mine who was going to be a lawyer and just deal with aviation, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. So 25 or 30 years ago, I got out of the Air Force, went to law school here in Dallas at the SMU Law School, which has the Journal of Air Law and Commerce, and became an aviation lawyer. So my practice, I got very, very busy in organizations like NBAA and NATA and AOPA, and so when I've had so much fun over the last 25 years. I get to work with people flying anything from 737s down to I have my little Cessna Cardinal that I putz around in, but most of my clients fly corporate jets. And over the years, I started at a really big firm and then came to this. At the time when I joined, it was a 15-lawyer firm. Now we're about a 75-lawyer firm, but we've kind of brought on some other really cool people. So a lot of you probably know my partner David Mayer. He's a walking encyclopedia on aircraft finance law. So he's a lot of fun. He loves CGI and schmoozing with everybody. We have another partner, Greg Reigel, who is a walking encyclopedia on FAA enforcement law. So he does a lot. We can all kind of do the same thing, but we all have our specialties. And then we have a young partner, James LeBrun, who's a former corporate pilot, who's also is kind of my right-hand man. So I do a lot of the stuff on how to structure the ownership, all the regulatory compliance, all the tax planning. We do a lot of tax planning, how you all do that. David is just a resource for finance. Greg is there in case something goes wrong. James helps me with everything. So that's a summary of, that's probably more than you asked for, but that's kind of a summary of our practice and where we're coming from.
But it's important, isn't it? Because everyone always says that aviation is the second most regulated industry after nuclear power. I've never seen anyone actually show the evidence. I don't know if you have.
I don't know if they've done it, but it is very highly regulated. I have that discussion with my clients all the time.
And it is different to other industries, isn't it?
It's different.
Or a startup, regulation is going to be part of your horizon. It's going to hit you eventually, isn't it?
Yeah. A lot of what we do, what a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people when they're coming into the airplane world, they focus very much on tax, and I totally get that because that's a very important thing to focus on. But I quite often remind people, I think you probably want to start with your Civil Aviation Authority, the U.S., the FAA, because it's the agency that has the most to say about how you're going to own and operate the airplane outside of tax. So we always start with, let's look at the federal aviation regulations. Let's look at the civil risk management that comes out of that. Then let's look, very importantly, at federal tax. Let's look at state and local tax. And I always tell people let's build a sandbox. Those are the four sides of the sandbox. There's a lot of places to play within that sandbox. But to your point, there aren't very many industries that have those different kinds of angles or masters that you have to serve with what you're doing. Maybe some of the like medical industries, but it's unique in that sense.
And one of the things you've been to Revolution, the things that everyone focuses on is getting their product certificated from EA or EASA. And you've got experience in that.
So and that's actually Greg helps me a lot. We've done a lot of the drone law and looking at that. I'm not going to. In fact, I will say about Revolution.Aero. So let's move into that industry segment. For years, our practice, what I spend most of my time dealing with is the corporate jets. But as these new technologies develop, I think it's absolutely fascinating. The pilot in me loves the idea of being in a little four-person high-tech thing and zipping out to the suburbs and all that. I think from a technological standpoint, and a George Jetson standpoint, and a Star Wars standpoint, that's all awesome. So I was really excited a couple years ago when you all started. I mean, your CJI events have just always been so awesome, and they're huge in the industry. When you started Revolution.Aero, that really caught my attention. I'm a policy wonk. I love the background behind why the regulations are there, what they do, what purpose they serve. So, to me, Revolution.Aero it's a really cool gathering place. For the first couple of years, everybody's been very focused on two things from the FAA. One is the vehicle certification, and I'm going to let other people talk about that. You have other panels that are going to be on the upcoming show that'll talk about that. And the other thing is air traffic control. How do you deconflict the traffic? And there are some other people that are going to talk about that. What I've been very interested in, and what I've talked about a little bit in the last couple of years for you all, and what I'm really excited because we have a really cool panel that we put together. We have a gentleman who's an associate administrator from the Department of Transportation that can talk to the high-level policy stuff. We have John McGraw from NATA, Doug Carr from NBAA. What I want to talk about is the operational side, right? What are the operating rules? Every time in the U.S., whenever an airplane flies, you have to comply with 14 CFR Part 91. If you're doing something that the FAA considers to be commercial in nature, then you generally, for this size aircraft, you also have to comply with Part 135. The fascinating issue with Revolution.Aero and this UAM and UAS is that everybody wants to sell on a per-seat basis, right? You're going to go in and you're not chartering the entire craft. You're buying a seat on that little craft. That's generally not permitted we don't have a regulatory scheme right now that allows for that. And I've talked to people with different, I've talked to folks from Uber Air and some of the manufacturers, and I've talked to FAA people. And this is what we're going to talk about more in the panel on the show is how are you going to rewrite the rules to allow for these new technology, but do it in a way that meets the purposes, the safety, the consumer protection, and the safety purposes that are spelled out in our Federal Aviation Act of 1958, which is our controlling statute that says what kind of rules are you going to operate under, right? So I think that's in the goal of, in talking to my panelists, we're getting ready for the panel, the goal is to have these three people that bring really deep knowledge and background on this area and present to the participants, hey, as you go forward, right now the FAA's plan is that they're going to let people seek exemptions from 135 and propose operations that the FAA will monitor, and then they'll use that essentially as a data gathering exercise to eventually rewrite the rules. That's the current thinking. The question is the participants want to do that, what are the policy goals that they need to be aware of so that they can have a meaningful conversation? it doesn't do you any good if you buy the aircraft, you have this aircraft and it's Part 23 certified and the ATO has figured out how to deconflict it, but there's no operating rules for it. It's become a very expensive paperweight. You can't actually fly in it. Right? So what are the policy things that the participants need to think about as we move forward into how do we redesign the operating structure? Does that make any sense whatsoever?
It does. But I guess do you want to explain the difference between the part that an airline operates on?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So from the operating standpoint, like I said, everybody in the U.S., if you're flying an aircraft, the baseline set of regulations are Part 91. Part 91 is very regulated, but it's relatively unregulated. Part 91 says have an airworthy aircraft, something that meets your Part 23 certification and complies with that. Make sure that it's properly maintained in an airworthy condition. There's a technical meaning to that. Make sure that you are utilizing pilots, at least initially. We'll see what happens with unmanned. But make sure you have pilots that are properly trained for that aircraft. Make sure that you are following the operating specs of the aircraft and that you're obeying air traffic control. If they tell you have to fly at 5,000 feet, go fly at 5,000 feet. Beyond that, there's no other. If you're flying an RBSM airspace above 28,000 feet, or you're using a minimum equipment list, or you're doing over water, you may need some additional authorizations. But there's no such thing as a Part 91 certificate. You just comply with those rules. It's relatively self-reporting. I fly around on my little Cardinal, my little single-engine piston. I've owned it for about 20 years. I've talked to the FAA about my airplane exactly once. I just happened to be I was on the field at Love Field on a Friday morning, and there was a safety inspector who needed to get up his ramp check count, and he ramp checked me. And it was a pleasant experience. He was very polite and professional, and we chatted about my cool avionics panel, and he made sure that I had my pilot certificate with me and that there wasn't fuel dripping from the wings. But he didn't ask me how I was operating the airplane, what I was doing, where I was flying. That's not what they do. So Part 91, I'm just expected to comply with it. Now, to your specific question, the moment you're trying to make money off of it, the moment you're carrying somebody around, and you want to get paid for that, that's no longer Part 91. Now you have to, in addition to Part 91, you have to comply with the applicable commercial parts for the type of aircraft and type of operation you're flying. If you're flying a transport category airplane and you want to sell, you're publishing some kind of schedule and you want to sell on a per seat basis. So we're talking, British Airways, American, Lufthansa, Southwest. That's a Part 121 operation. To do Part 121, I gotta go get a Part 121 air carrier certificate. That's from the FAA operations side of the house, arguably the hardest certificate to get. And I have to go to the Department of Transportation in the United States and get what's called economic authority, a certificate of public convenience and necessity, to say that I'm a real business and that when people buy on a per seat basis and then the flight is canceled, there's somebody there who's going to be able to refund my ticket price, or that there's somebody looking there to make sure that handicapped rules are being followed. Those are very important rules. That's Part 121. If you're flying something smaller than that in an on-demand structure, then now you're flying under Part 135. The difference under Part 135 is, other than there's a thing called Part 380, but generally speaking, under Part 135, you can't do that on a per-seat basis. There are some very narrow exemptions to that, but the general rule is that when you fly, when I go fly Part 135, I'm chartering the entire capacity of the aircraft. That's what charter operations are for. If I want to take my family skiing, I'm going to go charter a Learjet. I'm not putting other people on board that airplane. I'm getting the whole airplane. The problem with UAM and UAS, the concept is, they put out these really cool videos. I love them where, you're walking up to the building and you pull up your iPhone and you say, hey, I want to get out to the suburbs and there's a seat open. So I buy that seat and I go up the elevator and I walk onto this cool helicopter kind of looking aircraft. And 20 minutes later, there's no place in the rules right now for that operation, right? And it's both a DOT issue, that's Part 298, that they protect the consumer side of it. That doesn't allow for that. And it's Part 135. You don't sell on a per seat basis. So that's the issue, is we got to figure out I got people that want to fly on these aircraft. They don't know boo about aircraft. They just think it's really cool that they're going to be able to jump over the traffic and get to where they're going. And they're going to want to demand. They're going to want to. So here's the dichotomy. Everybody looks at these videos and, oh, that is so cool. And why won't they let us do that? Oh, that's so helpful. That's great. Until, not to be morbid, but until the first one crashes. Then they're going to be, hey, FAA, DOT, where were you? How did you let this happen? Right? That's the problem, is what's the level of regulatory oversight that's going to be required? How are they going to do that so that that passenger can be relatively confident? When I go get on an American Airlines flight, I'm pretty confident that it's going to be flown properly, and I don't have to worry. I don't have to go check out the pilots and make sure that they're qualified. So does that answer? Does that kind of give you a?
Yeah. I do wonder that when you got RAM checked, how quickly you said, by the way, I'm an aviation lawyer with a big litigation firm. I wonder how quickly that came out. Early on. We've actually got a question from Brian Garrett Glazer from evtol.com. So, and if you can come up now.
How does this work?
Yeah, we can hear you.
There we go.
Loud and clear.
Is there a camera option? There we go.
Yeah.
A really crappy camera, but thanks, David, for joining us. I appreciate the insight and you laying out the concerns between today and getting to how these operations will commence. It's very, very interesting. So thank you for that. I had an in-depth question about aircraft certification, and if this isn't the right fora for that, then we can push the question. But earlier this week, the FAA came out with 10. I'm looking for the exact wording here so I don't get it wrong on air. 10 airworthiness criteria for certifying 10 different UAS that companies are looking to use for transport of medical supplies and delivery and inspection and that kind of thing. And my question is, so the FAA has stated pretty clearly that for the time being, they seem to want to continue using 2117B to certify every UAS as a special aircraft and just sort of pull pieces from everywhere else, right? And I can't imagine that 30 years from now that's going to continue to be the case, right? At some point, they're going to have to define a class of aircraft or lay out generalized guidelines or something. And I guess the question is, how long is it going to take to get there? Because I think that, and what does it mean? Like, what does that really mean for the industry? Because I think that's going to be mirrored for eVTOLs, right? Clearly, they're doing the same thing for eVTOLs. People are mostly certifying, I guess, under Part 23 and pulling things together. What does it mean that the FAA is going to continue using this approach for at least the foreseeable future? Is that something that is going to hamper the speed at which these aircraft can come into service? Is that something that is going to increase the cost of pursuing certification because there is not a generalized set of requirements? Any light you could share on that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so that's a very good question. So a couple of thoughts to that. And again, it's for legal advice when you didn't pay for it and all that kind of stuff. But so you can take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, I guess. I'm giving you some high-level concept is what I'm saying. I am not, truthfully, I'm out of interest. I do watch the Part 21, 23 certification issues, and I've been tracking it, but I'm not part of that dialogue, and my partner, Greg Reigel, is more into it. So I don't want to say this is specifically what's going to happen under Part 9. But to your specific question, I can give you some insight on that. And that comes back to the policy issues. The example I used, and we talked about this 2 years ago, I think the first Revolution.Aero that we did, is at that point, DOT had just promulgated a new rule. It was called Part 295. It took industry 10 years to get that rule passed. The nature of regulatory oversight is not a fast process, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Is and I don't mean this in a pejorative or bad sense, but it's that dichotomy you have. Is we've got all this cool technology out there, and people want to go use it, and that's cool, and we want to happen fast. And that's all well and good until somebody gets hurt. And then the public will turn very quickly. I mean, just look at 737 MAX, right? Things can get very ugly very quickly if it's not done right. Now, in talking to the folks I have talked to in the FAA and in some of the discussion I've been, I do give them credit that they have recognized that this is a steamroller coming down the path. You know, in the past, agencies like the FAA have been very reactionary. Their mandate is not to be prospective. It's to react to what's happening, and it's been a long, drawn-out process. I do think that they've recognized that, and they recognize that the technology is changing so quickly that they are going to have to be more responsive. Part of the problem in the past was, and I've seen this more on the operational side I was talking about, the last thing you want, you know, I have great respect for the FAA and the safety inspectors and the engineers. There's some amazing talent there. But the last thing you want is a bunch of aviation, FAA safety inspectors and engineers sitting in a room by themselves trying to create out of whole cloth what they think the rules should be with no input from industry or from the operators. And that's been the traditional mode of rulemaking. And when that happens, invariably, it's not a very good rule, and there's very little buy-in. So my counsel to you in a policy sense is the quickest way the FAA can react is to take the existing rules and then operate under exemptions to the rules. And again, that kind of mindset I was talking about on the operational side is if you can come in with a well thought out, you've looked at all the rabbit holes, you've looked at where it should be, you can address the safety concerns, you're more likely to get, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. If you go to the FAA with nothing and say, hey, let me do this, nothing's coming out of that process. If you go in with a very well thought out, here's what I want to do and why, and there's a very specific exemption process that talks about you want to do something different than the rules are. It needs to be unique. It needs to be safe. You need to be able to justify it. But if you put that type of project or process together, that product together, that's how you speed up the response from the FAA. And if you can keep doing that and you can demonstrate safety, that's also going to be the quickest way to get a rule rewritten, right? It's really hard right now, especially under the previous administration. It'll be curious to see what happens with the previous one, but they shut down on rulemaking, right? So it's a little bit of a catch-22. It goes back to people want the rules. I want to know that when I get on board the Southwest 737 that it's been properly regulated. But I'm sympathetic to, I don't want so many regulations that I can't do a business, right? So it's that balancing act. So the more you can serve that up on a silver platter to the FAA, the better the response you're going to get and the faster it's going to be. And once you get in a good, solid exemption going, it's going to be a lot easier for them to promulgate it because they can take that and then they can put together the proposed rule. And when they publish it to the industry, when you go through a rulemaking process, they got to publish it. It's a notice of proposed rulemaking, and they got to let industry comment. Well, if it's already been part of the industry process, you're probably going to get pretty good support. If it's something that they created that's wacky, that's going to take years. Brian, does that answer your question at all, or does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can throw a follow-up, and then I'll get off stage and turn it back to you, Alistair, and thank you very much. So, you know, this push and pull between industry and regulators, with industry really leading the way that you describe, you know, I think makes perfect sense. But the follow-up is, does the FAA have the resources to do this properly? And the reason I ask, in part, and just to clarify, by the way, I'm a journalist, so I'm not certifying an aircraft myself. I would love to do that, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have the slightest idea what I was doing. But you know, recently the GAO published an audit, right, where they found that the speed at which the FAA has been able to look at new aircraft cert bases, to look at, you know, means of compliance published and adopted by industry, these things, has been slowed by a lack of sort of resourcing and guidance for its employees. So looking at this revolution, the technology side of it, the regulatory side of it, the aircraft cert basis, all of this, figuring out how to operate all of this, does the FAA have the resources to do this in a timely manner Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll get off stage now.
That is a great question, and I don't have a good answer for it because I don't know. So the way the FAA works is, to a large extent, they respond. They get congressional mandates. The Congress passes a new statute. They do the GAO. They mandated a illegal charter review in the last. Alistair and I have talked about that on other programs, and they have. We ask a lot of our civil aviation authorities. We do in the United States. They do in the UK. They quite often are undermanned and underpaid to some extent. And so do they have sufficient resources? Well, the question is, what's the political pressure on taking the resources they have and applying them to that field? I'm really talking kind of off the top of my head, but the way you do that is you work with organizations such as NBAA, the lobbying organizations, and you work with your Congress people, and you make a lot of noise to say to them, this is the industry that's coming down, this is where the industry is going. Congress, you need to make sure that the FAA has the resources to it. The FAA is not going to come out of that whole cloth. The only way they're going to get the people and the money is Congress is going to give it to them. So you got to go to Congress and push on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great answer. We've got a really nice question from Chris Daniels, CCO of Flarebright. Uber and others accepted the commercial risks of litigation and potentially illegal activity to set up their car taxi service in many countries in the world. Are the penalties under FAA or EASA sufficiently high for an operator not to ignore them?
I don't know that I can comment on.
What happens if you break FAA?
There's actually two answers to that question. So I can tell it. I don't want to say too much about EASA because I don't remember the penalty scheme under that. For the FAA, depending on how they would enforce, I will tell you some of the biggest civil penalties are a Part 135 operation, or what should be a Part 135 operation that is conducted in violation of the rules. Generally speaking, the starting point for a civil penalty for that could be up to $30,000 to over $30,000 per violation, which would be per flight. That's why if you saw, about 2 years ago now, there was a company up in Michigan that was doing what amounted to legal charter, and the initial penalty was like $3 million. Now that got negotiated down, but it was still a pretty hefty penalty. So that is one aspect of the risk management tool here. Are the penalties high enough? Well, I think if it's a one-time infraction, maybe not. If it's set up wrong and there are multiple infractions, that can start to add up. There's really they can stack as much as they want on top of it, and theoretically, there's no statute of limitations. The other big thing in the United States, and this is a little different in Europe, the legal philosophy in the United States is that the mechanism that causes good behavior is not just regulatory, it's civil liability. So in the United States, if, heaven forbid, one of these operators is conducting one of those flights on the way out to the suburbs, and there are 4 people on board, and probably at least initially they're going to be 4 pretty high net worth folks that can afford this, and that aircraft crashes, not only are you looking at the FAA looking at that, but you're potentially facing pretty significant lawsuits. If that aircraft hits another aircraft because they've collided over, I'm going to paint the nightmare scenario for you. You're over New York City, you have 2 that collide together, they crash down onto the pavement and take out a bunch of people with them. That's going to be pretty significant civil liability that could come out of that suit. What that number would be based, I'm being a lawyer, I'm giving you the worst case scenario, but it's going to be a combination of the regulatory and the civil liability that's the inhibitor. Now, there are some companies that give really short shrift to that civil liability. I deal with this all the time. I have some companies that are scared to death of the civil liability, and that's a big motivating factor for them. I have other companies, unfortunately, that kind of think, well, after that happens, to be blunt, we're all dead anyways, or the company will go out of business, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. That's the wrong way to think about it. But there are going to be some players, there could be some players like that out there.
I guess the other angle on Chris's question is it gets harder and harder, doesn't it, to get insurance the more FAA violations you have?
Yes. And that's actually, and I haven't talked to too many. I know that the insurance market is looking at this, but that's going to be a big question is, a lot of people think, a lot of the issues I deal with on a daily basis are you have to comply with the government regulations and you have to comply with civil liability. And the insurance carriers use a lot of language that are the same words as what the FAA says, but a lot of times they have two different meanings, or they're coming at it from two different angles. And a lot of people don't remember that an insurance contract is not a regulatory contract. It's a contract. It's an agreement between you and the insurance carrier that if you do X, Y, and Z and something happens, they will provide a certain amount of money to satisfy a judgment. And Alistair, you're absolutely right, is if you're over here violating those rules, you're increasing the risk profile. Insurance companies don't like that. So that's what's going on right now as far as the constriction in the aviation insurance market is the insurance carriers have gotten tired of payouts. They're looking at pilot qualifications, they're looking at regulatory history, that kind of thing. And that's going to be a big part of this discussion with the insurance industry when these vehicles start flying is what's the right amount of liability insurance for each flight. Typically you would do it as on a what's called a per occurrence basis. If that aircraft takes off with 4 people on board, there may be $300 million of liability insurance is available for a crash of that aircraft, that type of thing. I'm making that up. I don't know what they're looking at right now, but that's going to be part of that discussion because nobody, who in your right mind wants to go fly something that you're underinsured for it.
Okay, we've got another question this is from Danny Glazer, Senior Aviation Consultant and DER LRL Aviation. His understanding is commercial spaceflight operates on the basis passengers can make informed consent. They're willing to accept risk higher than Part 121/1 Part 135.
Yeah.
Could the FAA take that approach with people who want to be a passenger on a UAM?
That is a really good, very interesting question. So it triggers a couple of thoughts in my mind. One is with commercial spaceflight. Right now, the universe of people that are doing that is so minuscule, and that is so recognized as such a dangerous activity that it's more plausible there that you'll let somebody. It takes a sophisticated person with a sophisticated document in the right jurisdiction that can kind of waive that potential liability. I don't think that same concept is going to apply to the general passenger who is the suburban mom who just wants to get on. I keep thinking of this one video that they had, it was last year or the year before, where the lady walks up and 20 minutes later she's playing with her kids in the front yard. She may be really smart and very sophisticated, but not necessarily in this risk management sphere. So that's one thing. The second thing is when you're doing that type of waiver of liability issue, it's actually not really an FAA issue. It's a state law issue for where you, in the United States at least, it's more of a state law issue of where you're located. The lawsuit, so I'm in Texas. If you're here in Texas, there's one body of law that talks about just what types of liabilities are the courts going to let you waive, is maybe opposed to what New York says as opposed to what Miami says. So it's kind of a 50 state problem. And then the third thing is, it's great to say that I'm willing to waive it and take the risk in the abstract and before the crash. It's harder to do that after the crash. Now, if you crash on a space flight, right now at least everybody understands, well, yeah, you took the risk. But that's different than when you get on board an aircraft that the FAA is blessed. I think that's a different mindset. Does that make sense?
That's a good answer. I guess when you bring into state by state law, you bring in a life costs a lot more in the States, insurance. Would you launch in the US, or would you be looking for another jurisdiction?
So airplane jurisdictions on crashes, there are two different ways that it's decided, but most of the time it's where the accident occurs. So, and it's very hard for people to weigh that and say, well, for an aircraft crash, if I'm here in Texas, I want the laws of New York to apply because they're more favorable to crash. I mean, courts don't like doing that. So that's one problem. and I don't know that there's a good solution to that. We have talked to some people that are doing kind of early permutations of this, and we've talked about helping them set up their operations. And it really becomes a state-by-state analysis of where are you going to base your operations, and what do your legal documents need to look like, because you're not flying something that's going across state lines. If I'm doing an Uber out of downtown Dallas, I mean, we're pretty close to Oklahoma, but I don't think most of the flights are going to Oklahoma. They're going to be within Texas. So that's where you're going to end up having to do somewhat of a locality by locality analysis.
But would you be tempted to go to a different country completely?
Well, you might. I mean, that may be a driving factor to say people may do that analysis and say, I don't want to take that risk, so I'm just not going to do UAM operations in the United States, or I'm not going to do them in Texas. I'm going to go to the UK. I'm going to do that. I think that would be unfortunate, and I do think the law needs to evolve. And I will say, let's make sure we're making the distinction. There's kind of a dichotomy. The FAA. In fact, I see this question. In fact, let me roll into this question because it kind of rolls into this. Brian asked again, what areas do you believe the localities and states should have a say over the regulations and restrictions? And that's a really good question that kind of goes into this same thing. Keep in mind that the civil aviation authorities, in the United States, they preempt local law. So if the FAA says you've got to do X, Y, and Z, the state can't say, no, you don't need to do that. You've got to do that. Now, that being said, the type of regulations that the FAA passes are what constitutes an airworthy airplane, what are the air traffic control rules you have to fly, what rules do you need to fly under. The FAA doesn't really talk about, they reserve the right to civil liability, the post-crash, who's going to get sued, to the local jurisdictions. And so you're always dealing with that dichotomy, that two-pronged approach. Now, if you're in a lawsuit in the state and you're trying to establish that somebody ought to be liable for the conduct of that crash, they're certainly going to look at the FAA rules and see if that person was in compliance with the rules. And if they were, that's going to be a very good argument for them that they ought not be liable. If they weren't, that's a really good argument for them that they ought to be liable because they weren't complying with the rules. But generally speaking, civil liability issues stays at the state level. Now, another big issue to Brian's question, there's another whole thing that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's privacy. It's one thing when, and this has really come up a lot with drones, and I think it's going to continue to grow. It's one thing when I go out to the airport and I jump in my little Cardinal and I take off and I climb up to 1,500 feet, and I can fly around and I can kind of see in people's backyards, but I can't really. It's not that big of a deal. And where I'm flying, I'm not really impinging upon anybody's airspace. But if I'm taking off out of a skyscraper and I'm swooping down and staying pretty low and I'm flying over people's houses, or what's already happened with drones is I'm flying drones around people's private houses. Do you really want? Do you as a citizen want somebody flying overhead that's looking down in my pool, right, in my backyard, which I perceive to be my own private space? That's going to be another big area that has to get sorted out. It's going to be more for drones than UAM, but I think it's still going to apply because wherever you're flying around, people generally know that if you live next to an airport, you got to deal with the airport. If you're next to a UAM stop, you build a house and you get this thing coming in and out at all hours of the day, that's maybe another issue.
And do you see that being settled? Is that going to go to the court?
So that is a really local issue, and it's already been teed up in a lot of states, and there have been some really interesting articles that have been written upon how much preemption should the FAA have, and what can the local jurisdictions do. The general rule is that the local jurisdictions have a lot of say over things like civil liability and privacy, so long as they don't interfere with commercial air carriage or what the FAA allows. I mean, it's this dynamic tension, but the FAA is very mindful of, they don't want to put regulations in place that say you can't hover over somebody's backyard pool for privacy concerns. That's really not an FAA issue. Part of that is because they don't, what's appropriate in Texas may not be appropriate in Montana, may not be appropriate in Alabama, may not be appropriate in New York City. So that's going to have to get settled and that's going to take some time. It's going to be an ongoing dialogue with all these different jurisdictions.
Okay. Ryan DeMore, Aviation Tax, a manager of Aviation Tax and Financial Reporting at StatCom.
Yeah, hey, Ryan.
Tax question. Can you touch on the regulatory landscape of taxation when it comes to this areas? Are current FET regs sufficient to handle these new industries? Will the IRS overstep as usual? Ryan DeMore saying, or do you see them trying to come to a reasonable method? Like I always think they do. I always think they're reasonable.
Always reasonable. Talk about a loaded question. Thanks a lot, Ryan. The biggest problem, so a couple things come to mind when you ask that question. One is you got to keep in mind all these regulatory agencies, the FAA, the DOT, the IRS, the civil courts, they're all serving different masters. They have different policies that they're designed to enforce. So the DOT in the aviation world is primarily there to protect the consumer aspect of things. FAA is there to make sure that airplanes are safe and that passengers are safe from a safety operational standpoint to a large extent. The tax people are there. They could care less about what the FAA or the DOT are saying. What they care about is they have a mandate to collect taxes, and it's whatever Congress says, whatever regime Congress creates for the tax. I think there are going to be some overlaps in the sense that, it's a nightmare dealing with the IRS from my perspective right now in the sense that they don't really understand the industry as it is. And there's a constant dialogue on with them. There's been a lot of dialogue. NBAA has been super active, and NATA as well, on dealing with the IRS on the FET issues and trying to educate the people at the IRS as to how the industry really works. And they've been actually pretty responsive, and there have been the latest round of rules that came out, I would say there's some good things in those rules that are very appropriate, and it allows the IRS to collect the right kind of tax, but it's not inappropriate. I think, as much as the FAA is going to struggle with trying to regulate UAM, I can't even imagine how that's going to go with the IRS. Hopefully, to some extent, everything's moving faster. The fact that we're sitting around here having a conversation that's being participated in around the world, and that all this is going on, it's having the effect of more interconnectivity. And it's easier to, it used to be if you wanted to connect with the IRS, you had to pretty much be in DC and send a fax. It's a little easier now. So I'm hopeful that they will listen, and that they'll listen to things and they'll come up with the right way. But what the FAA defines as commercial is not what the IRS defines as commercial. They're two different things, and that's going to be an ongoing problem. So,
okay, question from Jeremy Fitton, CEO of Skylifter, which is a really innovative light and air lifting company. How often are aerospace suppliers held liable? As you can see where his question is coming from. Current qualified suppliers resistant to supply new type aircraft.
Yeah. So I can't give you numerically how often it is. I will tell you every time, traditionally or historically, when an airplane or an aircraft crashes, the very first target of any litigation is going to be the operator. It's the operator who has the obligation to make sure the pilots are trained and the maintenance is done correctly. That's where it's going to start. But then the next thing is any of the major components of the aircraft, that there's any indication that a failure of that equipment was a causal factor in the crash. Most of the time, I'm talking way out of school here. This is all anecdotal. I can't quote you things, but it's been my experience as both a pilot and a lawyer for the last 25, 30 years. If an airplane crashes, it's either because an air crew member did something not wise, or there was a major component failure that was uncontrollable. Those are generally the two fundamental causal actions. If it's a component factor, now it's a question of, was it designed incorrectly or was it maintained incorrectly? So to your specific question, if there was a design issue and it was never really safe to begin with, that's when you tend to see lawsuits against the manufacturers that may actually carry some heft. There have been lots of arguments about what happened to the general aviation industry in the United States, and they put in some liability limiting provisions that say, hey, if you're Cessna and you built an airplane 30 years ago, at some point you ought not be sued for a design problem. So yeah, suppliers can be held, but I think it's going to be less the case. Now this goes back to, I think the question Brian was asking is, a huge defense for the suppliers is, did we work with the FAA and did we prove to them that we have a type certificated product that met their regulations and therefore was deemed to be safe for flight? It received a type certificate or a supplemental type certificate. Was it a properly certificated aircraft? Because if it is, that's a powerful argument when you go into a lawsuit to say, hey, the FAA blessed this thing. It's not dispositive, but it's really powerful. So that's a little bit of the game you're playing, because if you're going to the FAA and there really is no rule in place and you're seeking in an exemption, kind of the downside of that is it's an exemption. You're operating outside of the established rules. So I don't know where that's going to go, but I think that's a fascinating policy question of, does that shift the allocation of liabilities because of the path you're taking? I think that's the right way to do it. If we want to get something figured out and done as quickly as possible, doing the exemption route is probably the best way from a policy perspective to do it. But you need to be cognizant, you all manufacturers out there, that's kind of a downside, is you're asking to operate outside of the space of accepted current regulations.
Sorry, question from Brian again. Broad question. In the drone space, we've watched operations take 10 plus years longer than initially expected due to both technology and regulatory issues, I think it's fair to say. Will we see a similarly delayed timeline for eVTOLs and UAM?
Man, if I knew that, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be making a lot of money someplace else. And I don't mean to be facetious. I mean, that is just that's the question. The downside is all the problems that have applied to drones, all the certification regulatory stuff, in dealing with an agency, again, that's not prospective in nature. That's not their design. That's not what they're there for. That's all headwinds that you're having to roll into. The flip side is, I think there's going to be more economic, especially as the younger generations come on board and they're more used to using their cell phones or their smartphones to jump on board the Uber. I think there's going to be much more of an economic push than there is perhaps for drones. I think there are less people that are using drones than the potential market you unlock. And so again, my counsel to the industry is, the way you get things to move faster is you go to Congress and you emphasize that that's where you want personnel and budget to be focused to move these things quicker.
Great, thanks, David. Audience, 25% think it will be pushed 10 years, 77%. Sorry, it's changing as I read it. 71% no. That was awesome. Thank you. If we have no more questions or comments, and thank you to Brian, Chris, Danny, Ryan, and Jeremy for theirs. Makes life so much easier. My life so much easier, not David. That was great. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm very much looking forward to the conference. Thank you for setting that up. Thanks for the chance to chat. I really appreciate that.
No, we appreciate it. And also, Ryan Flynn says, great questions and answers. And if anyone wants to join the networking, we'll take those now. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks. Y'all take care.
You too. Thank you.